And so now that we know what a living thing actually is and all the properties that are required for something to be considered alive, we need to think about how we can or how that life is organized, right? So we said that living one property of living things is that they have a high level of order and structure, and that organization or that order occurs at a lot of different levels. It can occur sort of at the microscopic level or the cellular level. It can occur at the level of an organism or an individual, and it can also occur at the level of groups or populations, kind of a macroscopic scale. And so living things need to function and interact with each other on all of these different levels, both microscopically, kind of at the individual level, and then also at the level of groups. And so we're going to talk about this hierarchy or this level of organization in the next few slides. And so these terms are important for you to start understanding how life is organized. I'm not going to ask that you memorize all of them, but it is important to learn this language of scientific terms so that we can have some more interesting conversations about the more complicated stuff. And so I have this list of organizational terms here just to get you all thinking about these words, what they mean, and so that we're all on the same page moving forward. And so this starting at the kind of bottom of organization or at the smallest possible level of life, we would start with what's known as an atom, which is the smallest unit of matter. And if you combine multiple atoms together and you hold them together with bonds, you make what's known as a molecule. And we're going to talk about molecules coming up kind of soon. We're going to talk about carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, all of those sort of building blocks of life. And these are considered molecules. And then a little bit larger than a molecule with more structure is something known as an organelle. And so you can think of an organelle as sort of the organ within inside a cell. It's a small structure, it performs a specialized function within the cell. And so one common organelle we always talk about is the mitochondria, right? And it's the powerhouse of the cell. And so technically, all of these levels, atoms, molecules, and organelles, are not alive. The first organizational level that actually is considered alive is the cell. And that's because atoms, molecules, and organelles can't really reproduce or grow on their own, and cells can. So a cell is the smallest structural and functional unit of life. So it's the smallest thing that we consider alive. And it is made up of organelles, which are made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms, right? And so you can see as we increase from atom to cell, we increase in organizational kind of complexity. And then we can move up even further in complexity. And instead of a group of organelles working together to create this structural unit of a cell, we can then put many cells together and have them work together to do the same thing or to perform the same function. And that's what's known as a tissue. We can do the same thing again with tissues and have them work together to perform the same function. And that's what's known as an organ. We can put multiple organs together and have them work to perform the same function. And that's what's known as an organ system. And then multiple organ systems come together to make what's known as an organism, which is sort of just an individual living entity. And so organisms are this highest level of complexity of this group. And they're made up of groups of organs or organ systems, all of which are working together to perform the same function. And so you can see here in this example, when we think about the levels of organization, you might think about a tissue as being sort of like a skin tissue or a lung tissue. And so you've got a bunch of lung cells that come together and they all work to perform the same function in a tissue. And then that lung tissue is put together into an organ, which is the lungs. And then if we take the lungs, which is one type of tissue or one type of organ, and then we add in your windpipe and your mouth, or multiple organs, they come together to be an organ system, which was the respiratory system. And then if we take the respiratory system plus the skin system, urinary system, digestive system, and all of these different systems, and they work together, they form an organism. And so looking out and kind of zooming out even further into organization, we can have individuals living on their own, but we can also have living individuals or organisms interacting with each other and living together. And so the first kind of level of organization at this macro level is known as a population. And a population is just all the members of one particular species, so humans, for example, that are living within a specific area. If you take multiple populations and they're interacting within the same environment, it becomes a community. And so you can sometimes think of a population as maybe like a family of humans, right? So all the members of that family that are living within the area would be the population. And then all the families in a neighborhood, multiple different populations, would be considered a community. And communities take into account all the interacting populations or all the living things in an environment. And once you add in the non-living factors as well, so you take all of the living things, all of the plants, all of the animals, all of the humans that are living, and then you add in all of the air, the water, the soil, the buildings, and all of the non-living components to that environment, you create what's known as an ecosystem. And so the ecosystem is the community, or all the living stuff, plus the environmental factors. And it's obviously bigger in terms of organization than a community itself. And finally, the highest level of organization is what's known as the biosphere. And a biosphere is just anywhere where organisms exist. And so in the case of the Earth, the whole Earth is the biosphere. It's the air, land, and water where everything is living. And so there are ecosystems within the biosphere, and within those ecosystems there are communities, and then within those communities there are populations, and then it goes down to organisms, and so on and so forth, all the way down to atoms. All right, and so at each level of the organizational hierarchy of life, from atoms to the biosphere, there is a new property that becomes kind of obvious or apparent that was absent at the lower level, right? And so if you're looking at the difference between an organism and a cell, organisms at their higher level of the hierarchy will have a lot of properties that cells do not. And these properties are likely more complex because as we go up in the hierarchy, the higher order processes appear, and higher levels of in the hierarchy have more complexity than the lower levels. So organisms are more complex than cells. So if you take a second to pause the video and answer the following question. So you want to list the levels of organization from the least complex or the least complicated to the most complex. And the things you're going to list are organelle, organism, and organ. So pause the video, take a second, come up with your answer. Okay, and so the answer to this question is B. Organelles are the least complex, then organs, and then organisms. And if you look back in your notes, you should be able to see that organelles are at the cellular level, organs are at that sort of individual level, but multiple organs make up an organism. And so organisms would be considered the most complex, and organelles would be considered the least. Right. And then take another second, pause the video, and answer this question. Do higher levels of biological hierarchy have less complexity? Is that true or is that false? So the answer is false. The higher the level in the hierarchy, the more complexity that particular level has. Okay, and so we know that all living things come from a common ancestor or a single point of origin, But now, when we look at the living things around us, from bacteria to plants to humans and other animals, you can't really help but notice that there's so much diversity in life. So we started at a single point with a common ancestor, and from there, we have generated all of these diverse living things. And that diversity is a product of evolution. And what evolution really is just change over time. And so, from the point of a common ancestor to today, diversity has happened through evolution. And we can actually look at evolutionary history and map it using a thing that's known as a phylogenetic tree, which you can see here in this figure on the right. And so, the way that you look at the phylogenetic tree is that basically everything on the left-hand side is very far in the past, and as you move further and further to the right, time passes, and the things all the way at the right would be considered things existing in present day. And so you can see the common ancestor here, and then these are the 6 kingdoms that we currently recognize today. And every time there's a branching point, right, so right here, there's a new distinct lineage, or there's a separation between something that was the same into 2 new different things. So here at this particular branch point, there's a separation between the cells that did not have a nucleus up top on that branch and all the cells that do down here, or between the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. And so every time you see a branch, that means there's some new emerging property that distinguishes this branch from everything else in that one. And even though there's a lot of diversity in life, there's still enough similarities between certain organisms and some living things that you can start grouping them into categories, specifically really broad categories like these kingdoms listed here. And the guy who really discovered and started this science of grouping living things and naming them is Carolus Linnaeus. You can see her on the right. And he developed the science of taxonomy, right, which is the grouping and naming of organisms. And he developed rules for it. One of the most important rules, which I am going to ask you to know, is binomial nomenclature. And so it's the specific way that we name organisms scientifically. And it consists of their genus and their species, all italicized, with the genus being capital and the species being lowercase. So for example, humans, their binomial nomenclature name is Homo sapiens, where Homo is the genus and sapiens is the species. And you can see it's written where the H is capitalized and this S is lowercase. And so I am going to ask you probably to know how to name things correctly using the scientific notation. So I'll give you a bunch of different Homo sapiens written in different ways, and you have to choose the one that has the correct capitalization as well as the italicizing. So in addition to sort of life generating these organizational hierarchy, man decided that we were going to create more hierarchy, right? And rather than the hierarchy created by biology, this is the hierarchy created by man. Basically categories in which we can group organisms into based on their similar properties. And so we start at the top by grouping things into what are known as domains. And domains are the biggest category, or the ones that include the most living things. And then we move down through these categories to kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then finally species. And species is considered the least inclusive group, or the one with the least stuff in it. And so if you look here, you can see that in humans, they're part of a domain called eukarya, which includes every single organism that has nucleated cells, which as you can imagine is like a shit ton. And by the time we go down through the taxonomic hierarchy, we are at one specific species, Homo sapiens. To sort of illustrate that principle, you can see the categories listed here from most inclusive at the bottom with the domain all the way up. You can see that eukarya includes all of these different organisms. And then the kingdom Animalia includes slightly less. And as we move up through each successive level, there's less and less inclusion, or just less stuff in each category. And you do have to know them in order from most to least inclusive, And this mnemonic, Dear King Philip came over for good spaghetti, is helpful in doing that.